Yeah.
Madam President, I rise to discuss the supplemental emergency security package that is currently being debated in this body. Yesterday, the comprehensive package that included the bipartisan border provision was voted down after Republican colleagues did a 180 and chose to oppose it. But there's an urgent need to move forward with a supplemental package, and so what we are now working on in this body is a slimmed-down version that would still do a tremendous amount of good. Humanitarian aid for Gazans and others around the world who need it, state disaster relief funds for states that suffered flood, hurricane, drought, wildfire, support for our allies in the Indo-Pacific to promote regional stability there, support for defense aid to Israel, and support for defense aid for Ukraine. And we're in the process of trying to find how we can move forward together on that package, and in my view, it's very important that we do so and that we finish this before we recess. And it is my hope that when we do, we'll be able to do it in a way that carries a significant bipartisan vote, because that will increase the likelihood that it will be acceptable to the House of Representatives. I want to talk about one particular aspect of this discussion, an amendment that I am filing together with 28 colleagues that frankly should be a no-brainer accepted on a voice vote by all 100 senators. And it has to deal with the provision of military support for the defense of Israel. The proposal that President Biden made, which is now more than 2 months old to the body, included a recommendation of defense support for Ukraine, for Israel, for Taiwan, and then also potentially other nations in the Indo-Pacific. Some of the funding is to implement the AUKUS framework between the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. Defense aid given by the United States to other nations traditionally carries with it a congressional notification requirement. And that requirement, to kind of short form it, works in a very simple way. Even when we voted to allow the defense aid to go forward and we've appropriated money for it, when an administration of either party is ready to transfer the aid, they give a notification to Congress about the transfer so that Congress can review the aid and make sure that it's the kind of military aid that was intended when the bill was passed. So to give you an example, if we're doing transfers of foreign military aid to Egypt, and we've done that in the past, and the purpose of it is to enable Egypt to fight terrorism, we often want to see what the weaponry is so we can determine, wait, is that weapons that would be useful in counterterrorism, or is that weapons that could be misused against civilian protesters, for example? And so the congressional notification requirement is an important way that Congress can check to make sure that support that we have voted for is actually being provided in the way that we intended. The notification requirement isn't onerous. It requires that Congress be given a certain, not lengthy, but short period of notice where we can analyze to determine whether the aid is the kind that we intended. And if it isn't, we don't necessarily have the ability to veto it, but we can ask additional questions of the administration. This is what oversight's about. This is what Congress needs to do. And this is tradition with respect to arms transfers to any nation. In the request that was delivered to Congress 2 months ago, there was a small provision in the request that puzzled me. And it said that the traditional congressional notification provisions under this supplemental bill would not apply to any of the defense aid to Israel. I support defense aid to Israel, and I've supported it during my entire career in the United States Senate. But I don't support this administration or any administration bypassing Congress and not providing us the notification about this aid. In the supplemental bill, the notification would still apply to aid to Ukraine. It would still apply to aid to Taiwan. It would still apply to aid to other nations, but not to aid delivered to Israel. I reached out to the White House nearly immediately to ask why this was done, and the answer was, we'll have to get back to you. And I have not gotten any answer, much less an acceptable answer, about why we would want to bypass congressional notification of this aid. Why should Congress vote to bypass ourselves? Why should Congress say, yes, you can bypass us and not give us notice of this aid as is traditional? The congressional notification provision does have an exception for emergencies. In the event of emergencies, the administration can say, this is an emergency and we need to do it right away. And that emergency power has been used twice in the last couple of months to do expedited aid to Israel. I would not propose to take that power away, whether it be for Israel or Ukraine or any other nation. But why would we want to allow Congress to be bypassed in non-emergency situations? And so the amendment that I have filed with 28 colleagues, and many of whom are standing on the floor with me today, would simply say that the same standard should apply to aid to Israel as applies to Ukraine and the other nations. That, yes, we're supporting this aid, but when an administration transfers it, Congress should get notice so we can ask questions if we determine that we need to. I endeavored to get this provision in the base language of the bill that we'll hopefully be voting on soon, and I failed in that. And I was told the reason is that my Republican colleagues did not support it. Why wouldn't Republican colleagues want a Democratic administration to give them notice about arms transfer so they could ask questions about it? I don't get it. But that's the reason that it's not in the base bill. And yet it is my hope as we get into this debate, and I know there's significant discussion about the extent of amendments, if any, that will be offered, I would hope to be able to bring this up, and I would think it should get an overwhelming vote in this body. I have colleagues who are here to speak, and I want to just say one last thing as I conclude. This is not a box-checking thing. Congress having oversight over war, peace, and diplomacy is critically important. We see what's happening more broadly in the Middle East with the U.S. engaged now against the Houthis in the Red Sea and in Yemen, with the U.S. engaged against Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria, with escalation of Hezbollah firing rockets into Israel. And I think many of us are worried about the U.S. slipping, stumbling into another war in the Middle East, which in my view would be a disaster. The United States should be providing support for our allies, but in my view, it would be a disaster for the U.S. to be engaged in another war in the Middle East right now. It would be Vladimir Putin's dream. It would be Xi Jinping's dream. It would be others' dream to have us entangled in the Middle East right now, but I think it would be a horrible thing for the U.S. to do that. But if that is to be a possibility on the table, let it be debated here. Let it be debated by Congress in full view of the American public. Let's see what the stakes and the consequences and the risks and the benefits would be. But let's not stumble or slide our way into an escalating set of military hostilities in the Middle East with U.S. troops involved. The provision about congressional notification on arms transfers is part of this very thing, to make sure that important matters of war, peace, and diplomacy are not just done by any executive, but that there is full buy-in by Congress, lest we find ourselves in a war that we shouldn't be in. And so I'm going to work to see if I might be able to get this as part of the package that we're negotiating. And again, I would think any member of the Article I branch should not casually accept an evisceration of its oversight powers over arms transfers. And with that, Madam President, I would like to ask unanimous consent that my legislative fellows, Hannah Kaufman and Angelica Perkins, be granted floor privileges for the duration of their time with my office.
Without objection.
Great. Thank you. I now yield the floor.